The Sorrath Tower had 611 landings and not one working elevator, and that was exactly why I liked it. I want to say that up front, because everything that happened started with the elevators being dead, and I don't want anyone thinking I climbed that stairwell out of virtue. I climbed it because the company that owned the decommissioned launch tower paid me to inspect the structure twice a week, and the structure had no power, and a man who wants to keep his knees in working order has to find some reason to enjoy a thing he's stuck doing. Anyway, I found mine. I liked the quiet. I liked the sound of my own breathing against 600 flights of bare metal stairs spiraling up through a dead launch tower nobody had fired in 11 years. Orson Station kept Sorrath Tower standing because tearing it down cost more than maintaining it, and maintaining it meant somebody walking it, flight by flight, checking bolts and rust, and the long vertical dark for cracks that might bring the whole column down on the warehouses below. That somebody was me. Tomas Rake, 47, night shift, 6 years in. My wife used to ask why I took a job that put me alone in a stairwell from midnight to dawn, and I never had a good answer for her, beyond the plain fact that I liked the work, the steady climb of it, the way a problem either showed itself in the steel or it didn't. No arguing, no negotiating, just bolts and welds and the honest fatigue of metal under load. She's been gone 4 years now. Not dead, just gone, to a drier climate on the inner rim, and a man who didn't smell like machine oil. And the stairwell never once asked me to explain myself, which I'd come to appreciate more than I probably should have. The tower itself was a relic of better times. Built 60 years back when Orson Station still ran cargo and crew launches out to the deep routes, Sorrath Tower had been the spine of the whole operation, elevator shafts running its core, crew quarters stacked along its mid-levels, the launch gantry crowning it at landing 611, where the old firing platform still sat rusted and silent, under a sky dome long gone opaque. Grime. And what was left was a column of dead steel that some accountant somewhere had calculated was cheaper to maintain than demolish. And so I walked it, twice a week regular, more when the inspection logs flagged something, alone with a flashlight and a tool bag, and the particular silence of a building too big to be this empty. I'd long since stopped expecting anything to surprise me up there. 11 years is a long time for a structure to sit unused, and in 6 years of walking it, I'd found rust. I'd found the occasional nesting bird that had gotten in through a cracked vent. I'd found a dead transient once on landing 40 who'd climbed up looking for shelter and hadn't survived the cold of an unheated tower in winter, which I still thought about more than I let on. an entire colony of small burrowing creatures that had somehow established themselves in the gutted machine room on landing 190, which had taken the better part of a month, and a wildlife specialist from the station's environmental office to sort out properly. I'd never found anything like what I found on landing 280. The tower's history mattered to what happened later. I think, more than I understood at the time. Kelvath Tower wasn't named for the dragon line that would eventually come looking for one of its own inside it. That was a coincidence the kind of universe I live in apparently still allows. Two unrelated uses of the same old word from two unrelated languages. Human and draconic both having independently landed on some root sound for height or reaching. The tower carried the name of the original station administrator who'd commissioned it, a man dead longer than I'd been alive, whose portrait still hung, filthy with undisturbed dust, in the lobby 7 flights up from the ground entrance. I used to study that portrait some mornings on my way out, an old habit I never fully explained even to myself. The way you sometimes fix on some small fixed point in a place that otherwise changes nothing year to year. It was a Tuesday. I remember because Tuesdays were my long inspection nights, the ones where I walked the full tower top to bottom instead of just the lower third, and I was maybe 4 hours into the climb, past the point where my knees had stopped complaining, and settled into the dull, steady ache that meant I'd be feeling it Wednesday no matter what. Where the old crew quarters had been before the company gutted them for scrap metal on the way out the door. I knew something was different before I came around the spiral's last curve and saw her. The air was warmer than it should have been. 6 degrees warmer, my handheld read later, in a column that hadn't seen active heating in over a decade. And there was a smell underneath the usual stairwell smell of cold metal and dust. Something like a forge that had been let to cool, ash and warm iron, and an animal warmth I didn't have a word for yet. She'd wedged herself into the doorway of the old crew quarters, where the frame was wide enough to take her shoulders if she folded down small, and she watched me come up the last flight of stairs with an expression I can only call braced. Not aggressive. I want to be clear about that, because I think a lot of people hear dragon and picture teeth first. Braced! The way a man braces for a blow he's decided he can't avoid and won't beg off. She was young. I could tell that much even not knowing the first thing about dragons. The same way you can tell a colt from a grown horse, without knowing the breed. Something in the proportions, the way the limbs hadn't quite settled into their final weight. Slate gray scales running to rust red along the ridge of her spine and the long whip of her tail. Horns still soft-looking and short. Not yet grown into the hard ivory curve I'd later learn was the mark of a dragon past her first century. One wing sat wrong against her side, not broken in the jagged, obvious way I half expected. No visible blood, no bone showing. But held at a stiff diagonal her body kept trying to correct and couldn't, the membrane drooping where the strut beneath it had failed to do its work. And I want to admit straight out that I knew better even as I said it. That dragons weren't animals and didn't deserve that tone. But in that first moment I didn't know anything except that something large and clearly hurting was looking at me like I might be the thing that finished the job. Whatever had already started. She didn't move. Didn't make a sound either. Not that visit. Just watched me, with eyes the color of struck flint, gold burning at the center of the gray, her chest working in short, controlled breaths, like she was rationing even that small expense. I didn't try to touch her. I didn't radio it in, either. And looking back, though I didn't understand it then, that was the choice that mattered, more than any other I made in the whole 16 weeks that followed. Orson Station had protocols for exactly this kind of encounter. A whole division built around managing contact with the dragon kind, who passed through this stretch of frontier, on trade routes and diplomatic circuits between the Reach territories and the human-settled rim. Knew the emergency channel by memory. Knew what was supposed to happen the moment a citizen encountered an unregistered dragon on station property. I didn't use the channel. I told myself afterward it was because she looked like she'd run from something. And calling station authority down on a thing that's running feels too much like handing it straight back to whatever it ran from. That was true, as far as it went. It wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was that Landing 280 was warm and quiet in a tower that had been cold and quiet for 11 straight years. However much that was just fear, looking for any door that wasn't the one it had already tried. And some selfish, unexamined part of me wanted to keep that feeling a while longer, before I handed the whole situation over to people with clipboards and procedure manuals. So I left her my thermos of tea on the third step down from the landing, close enough to reach, far enough that I wasn't crowding her, and backed away without turning my back fully, the way you do with dogs that haven't decided yet whether to trust you. all the way to 611 and back down past her landing again, where she hadn't moved, and home to an apartment that felt, that night, emptier than it usually did. $280 of them, between me and a hurt thing that hadn't asked for my help and might not want it offered twice. I came back Thursday with 2 thermoses instead of 1, on the off chance the first hadn't been enough, and a burner I didn't usually carry, on the chance that whatever she needed wasn't going to come out of a company commissary in any form she could use cold. She'd drunk the first thermos and all, I realized when I found it on the landing, dented along one side but otherwise intact, which told me something about both dragon strength and dragon manners, since she'd clearly been careful enough not to crush it past use even while drinking from a vessel never designed for a mouth her size. She was further back in the doorway when I arrived this time, deeper into the gutted quarters, but watching the same way, with the same braced patience. It took 4 visits and a fair amount of trial and failure with the station commissary before I worked out feeding her properly. The first attempt I'd brought up was a standard ration pack heated on the burner, the kind every maintenance worker on station carried for long shifts, and she'd eaten it without complaint but without any real interest either, and I'd understood from the way she picked at it that whatever dragons ate by preference, it wasn't processed station ration. The second attempt I'd raided the commissary's protein stores and seared a cut of something closer to actual meat, and that had gone considerably better. Enough that I started budgeting a real portion of my own wages toward it, without telling anyone why my grocery habits had changed. I won't bore anyone with the rest of the details except to say that dragons, it turns out, will eat almost anything provided it's been properly seared, and that a tower mechanic with a portable burner and more patience than sense can manage. That much even 600-odd stairs from the nearest working kitchen. By the second week she let me sit at the edge of the landing, 4 meters off, while she ate. By the third week, 3 meters. She still hadn't spoken a word in my presence, and I'd stopped expecting her to. She'd talk when talking served some purpose she could see, and not before. There was a particular evening in that second week I still remember clearly. Mostly because it was the closest I came in the whole 16 weeks to losing her trust before I'd properly earned it. I'd brought up a blanket from my own apartment, an old wool one I hadn't used in years, thinking the gutted crew quarters with its stripped insulation panels couldn't be holding much heat overnight, even with whatever internal warmth she generated on her own. I'd set it down at the same 3-step distance I'd used for the thermos, and she'd gone rigid the moment she saw it. Every line of her body, going from braced watchful to something closer to alarm, and it took me a long, confused minute to understand why a blanket of all things had spooked her worse than a stranger, climbing 280 flights of stairs in the dark ever had. It is the shape, she told me, much later, once she trusted me enough to explain it. A net, to dragon eyes, looks very much like a folded blanket from a distance, in poor light. We are netted by hunters along certain unregulated stretches of the rim, for trophy, or for parts. I am sorry. I knew, somewhere underneath the fear, that you meant nothing of the kind. The body does not always wait for the mind to finish reasoning. I'd left the blanket on the landing without comment, backed off further than usual, and come back the following visit without it, and that, more than anything I'd done up to that point, seemed to be what finally tipped something in her favor. Whatever instinct in her had flagged me as a threat that night, watching me read the signal correctly and adjust without argument, apparently counted for more than any amount of careful T-thermos diplomacy had managed on its own. I'm not a talker by trade or temperament. Ask anyone who worked dayside with me before I moved to nights. They'll tell you I could go a whole shift on 3 words if the work allowed it. But something about the stairwell's particular quiet, and her particular quality of listening, careful and total, made me want to fill the space between us with something other than the sound of the sound. Burner. I told her about the tower's history, the launches it used to handle before the company that built it folded, the families who'd lived on the lower landings back when Kelvath Tower was a working colony spine. Instead of a corpse, somebody paid me to mind twice a week. I told her, eventually, a little about my wife. Not the parts that still caught in my throat if I let them, but the smaller, safer parts. The kind of details a man can hand over without it costing him anything. I never once asked her name. Something in the careful, contained way she held herself told me that was a door I hadn't been invited through, and I'd learned a long time before that night not to push at doors that weren't offered open. She told me anyway. Eventually, on a night in the 4th week, by then on landing 330, when I'd carried the burner and the food bag and my increasingly unhappy knees 290 steps further than any sane man my age had business climbing on a regular basis. and I felt it as much as heard it. A resonance that came up through the landing's steel plating and into the soles of my boots. The first sound I'd heard her make that wasn't breath, or the scrape of scale against metal. That was my name. Because it seemed like the word she wanted picked up on. I left it on the trial floor. She said it flat, reporting a fact she'd already made some kind of peace with reporting, though I'd come to understand much later that peace had very little to do with it. A flight cadet does not return from a failed trial wearing the name she carried into it. There is a different word for what I am now. I have not decided yet whether to use it. I didn't ask what the word was. I asked instead, because it seemed more immediately useful. Can I still call you Vethka? She held me in that flint gold gaze a long moment, long enough that I felt the weight of being studied by something far older in its kind than its size suggested, and then something in her shoulders came down by half an inch. The first thing I'd come to recognize, over the following months, as the closest her kind allowed themselves to a smile in front of a stranger. In pieces and not all at once. What had brought her down 280 flights of dead stairs to hide in a gutted crew quarters on a human station. A flight trial gone wrong over the Kelvath Reach's home airy, 300 meters up in clean air. A wind that turned without warning at the worst possible second of the trial's final ascent. A strut shattered against rock on the way down in a fall that should by every reasonable account have killed her, and had somehow only broken her. Instead, she'd glided what distance she could manage on the one good wing, lost altitude faster than she could control it, and come down hard, through an open maintenance hatch in the tower's upper shaft that some long-gone worker had left cracked decades before, and never sealed. From there she'd crawled, there's no gentler word for it, down 280 flights of stairs on a damaged wing, and 3 good limbs, rather than be found broken on the airy floor in front of the entire flight council that had watched her attempt the trial. They will be looking, she told me, somewhere past week 6, on landing 410 by then. The Reach does not lose a cadet quietly, even a failed one. There will be a search, eventually, when they exhaust the closer possibilities. However long it takes, she said, in a tone that made plain she'd rather it took the rest of her life. There was a long silence after that, the kind I'd learned by then not to fill with talk just for the sake of filling it, and when she spoke again it was on a different subject entirely, the way she sometimes did when a thing had been sitting too heavy to stay on directly. You have never asked me what becomes of a dragon who fails her trial and is never found, she said. Whether there is some understood path for that. I think you have not asked, because you assumed there was a kind answer, and did not want to learn there was not. Figured you'd tell me if you wanted me to know, I said. There is no kind answer, she said. A flight cadet who vanishes after a failed trial is, after enough years pass without contact, presumed to have chosen exile over the shame of return. It is not forbidden to come back, formally, but the longer the absence runs, the harder the return becomes, until eventually it becomes easier for everyone, including the cadet herself, to simply remain gone. I did not know that when I came down those stairs in the dark with a broken wing. I have only worked it out since, sitting here, doing arithmetic of my own to go alongside yours. Because I've come to think it mattered more than anything either of us ever said out loud. 410 landings is not a walk a man takes lightly. It isn't even a hard hike, exactly. It's an act of slow, repeated, deliberate stubbornness that puts a body through wear it was never built to absorb. Twice a week at first, then 3 times, then most nights I could manage by week 8. Because by then, I wasn't doing it for the inspection contract anymore, and we both knew it. Even if neither of us said so, I'd find myself at the bottom of the tower most midnights, lacing my boots, running the same arithmetic I always ran. 611 landings total, Vethka, somewhere past the 400 mark, and inching higher herself some nights, like she was testing whether the good wing alone might one day carry her the remaining distance. And I'd start up the stairs anyway, one flight at a time, because that was the only unit the stairwell understood. You couldn't shortcut to where she was. You had to climb every step of the distance between. There's a kind of patience that's really just stubbornness dressed up in patience's clothes. And I think that's the only variety I've ever genuinely had. I want to be clear that I'm not a brave man, and never claim to be one. Nothing I did in that stairwell required courage in any meaningful sense. No one was ever in danger from anything more dramatic than my own aging, knees and the long fall waiting. Was a willingness to keep showing up at the bottom of those stairs night after night, and start climbing, without demanding to know in advance when it would end, or what exactly it would cost me by the end of it. I'd done the same thing with my marriage, for whatever that comparison is worth. Right up until the night showing up simply stopped being enough to hold it together. I still don't fully understand why it worked this time, when it hadn't worked that time. Maybe it was that Vethka, unlike my wife in those last hard years, never once asked me to become something other than what I already plainly was. She let me climb toward her at my own pace, and met me partway when her own healing allowed it. And that turned out, in the end, to be the whole of what either of us actually needed from the arrangement. There's a particular kind of relief I've come to understand since, in being needed by something that never once asks you to explain yourself, only to keep showing up, and I hadn't realized, until that stairwell gave it back to me, how long I'd gone without it. By week 10 she could put real weight on the bad wing, gingerly, testing the mend with small experimental flares of motion that filled the landing with the smell of warm metal and banked fire. By week 12 she'd started climbing down to meet me at 450, instead of waiting for me at 410, which meant I'd shaved 160 steps off my nightly climb, and felt, absurdly, like I'd lost something rather than gained it, until I understood what she was actually doing. She wasn't avoiding the climb. She was choosing to close part of the distance herself, doing the same stubborn flight-by-flight arithmetic from her end that I'd been doing from mine since the first Tuesday. "You don't have to keep coming," she told me once, around week 14, in a tone I recognized uncomfortably well from my wife's mouth in the last bad year of the marriage, testing, carefully, whether I'd take the exit she was offering me if she held the door open long enough. "I know," I said, and kept climbing the next night same as always. After. Not just the wing and the name, but the world she came from. The Kelvath Reach, she told me on a slow night around week 11, was one of the older flight lines along this stretch of frontier. Not the largest, not the most powerful, but old enough and proud enough that a failed trial carried weight a smaller, newer line might have shrugged off. Her mother sat the flight council. Her mother's mother had founded half the Reach's current airy territory in a campaign 2 centuries gone that dragons still told as a cautionary tale about ambition outrunning preparation. It was the ceremony that marked a cadet's transition from juvenile to adult standing within the line. The kind of thing that, failed publicly, could shape how a young dragon was regarded for decades after, regardless of whether she ever attempted it again and passed. It isn't that failure is forbidden, she explained to me once, in the particular careful tone she used when she was working through something she hadn't fully untangled even for herself. Failure happens. Wind turns. Struts shatter. Is failing in front of everyone, and then needing to be carried away from it. I did not want to be carried. So I left, on my own power, however little of it remained, and I came down 280 flights of human stairs, rather than let anyone watch me be carried even one. That's a hell of a lot of stairs to manage on 3 working limbs, I said. It was, she agreed, and there was something almost like dry humor in it, the first I'd heard from her. I do not recommend the experience. By week 13, I'd worked out a rough rotation that let me cover both the company's required inspection points and the long climb up to wherever Vethka had settled that week, which meant my reports to the company started taking longer to file, and my sleep schedule started fraying at both ends, and neither of those facts bothered me anywhere near as much as they probably should have. I told myself I was managing it fine. I want to say, looking back, that I mostly was. I never missed a flagged inspection item, never let the structural logs go stale, never gave the company any reason to ask why their night mechanics hours had gotten so unpredictable. But there were mornings I came home and sat at my kitchen table for 20 minutes before I had the energy to make coffee, and I knew exactly why, and I kept climbing anyway. because the alternative was leaving a hurt thing alone in a dead tower with nobody bringing food up 200 flights of stairs. And I'd never once in my life been able to walk away from that kind of obligation once I'd taken it up, whatever it cost me to keep carrying it. We talked about other things too, as the weeks went on, things that had nothing to do with wings or trials or stairs. Things that had nothing to do with wings. Whether we chose it the way dragons chose their flight roles, or whether it was assigned, and I told her the truth, that for most of us it was somewhere uncomfortably between the two, chosen in theory, constrained in practice by what paid, and what was available, and what a man's body could still manage by the time he understood himself well enough to know what he actually wanted. She found that strange. Dragon flight roles, she explained, were determined early, by aptitude and temperament observed from hatching onward, and a dragon generally knew by adolescence what role the Reach would ask of her. Scout, defender, council voice, breeder of the line, a dozen others, and trained toward it without the long, uncertain drift I described as ordinary to human working life. For you at 6 months old. It is sometimes hell, she agreed, quietly, and didn't elaborate further that night, and I didn't press. There was a night, around week 12, that I think about more than most of the others, because it's the one where I understood the shape of what had actually happened to her, beyond the broken wing and the lost name. I brought up a second burner that night, an old one I'd had sitting in a closet since before my wife left, because the first had started sputtering on the high landings where the air ran thinner, and I wanted a backup in case the climb up was wasted on a dead flame. Everything mechanical, head tilted, the way I imagine an engineer watches another engineer's hands. "You repair things for a living," she said. It wasn't quite a question. More like I tell other things when they need repairing, and then mostly I climb stairs and write reports, I said. Towers mostly sound. Just old. Old things need somebody checking on them regular, even when nothing's wrong. So you catch it early when something finally is. That is not so different from what a flight cadet does for an ARI, she said. We check the structure of the line, the old agreements, the old debts, the boundaries that have not been tested in a generation. We fly the trial routes not because anyone expects us to fail, but because flying them is how the Reach knows the routes themselves still hold. She was quiet a moment, turning the words over the way she did, when she was deciding how much further to go. I did not fail because I was unprepared. I want you to understand that, since you are the only one I have told any of this to. I had trained 11 years for that trial. I knew the route better than dragons twice my age, who had flown it for decades. The wind that took my strut was not a wind anyone could have predicted. It was simply the kind of wind that exists in the world, and on that particular day, it found me. That happens with structures too, I said. I've signed off on welds that held fine for 30 years, and then failed on a Tuesday, for no better reason than 30 years finally catching up to the metal all at once. Doesn't mean the weld was bad. Means metal's got its own clock. And sometimes the clock runs out exactly when you can least afford it to. Yes, she said, and there was something almost startled in the way she said it, like I'd handed her a piece of language she'd been missing. Exactly that. My clock ran out exactly when I could least afford it to, in front of everyone who would ever need to trust me with the route again. That is the part I have not found a way past. Not the fall, the audience. Not having much experience with them myself, so I just kept working the burner's fuel line and let the quiet sit between us a while, which I'd come to understand by then was sometimes the more useful offering anyway. By week 13, I'd worked out a rough rotation that let me cover both the company's required inspection points and the long climb up to wherever Vethka had settled that week, which meant my reports to the company started taking longer to file, and my sleep schedule started fraying at both ends. And neither of those facts bothered me anywhere near as much as they probably should have. I told myself I was managing it fine. I want to say, looking back, that I mostly was. I never missed a flagged inspection item, never let the structural logs go stale, never gave the company any reason to ask why their night mechanics hours had gotten so unpredictable. But there were mornings I came home and sat at my kitchen table for 20 minutes before I had the energy to make coffee, and I knew exactly why. And I kept climbing anyway, because the alternative was leaving a hurt thing alone, in a dead tower, with nobody bringing food up 200 flight of stairs, and I'd never once in my life been able to walk away from that kind of obligation once I'd taken it up, whatever it cost me to keep carrying it. There was one night in that stretch, week 13, close to morning, when the burner ran out of fuel halfway through cooking, and rather than climb all the way back down for more, I sat with her on the cold landing and we ate what had only half-seared, and neither of us said much about it, and somehow that turned into one of the better nights of the whole 16 weeks. She told me, unprompted, about the area itself, not the trial, but the place, The high stone shelves where her line had nested for longer than human memory ran on this stretch of frontier. The particular quality of wind that came up off the canyon floor in the mornings and made the whole area sing faintly, if you knew how to listen for there. I told her about the apartment I'd moved into after the divorce, smaller than the one I'd shared with my wife, on a lower level of the station where the windows didn't face anything worth looking at, and how I'd never quite gotten around to hanging anything on the walls, because it had never felt like the kind of place a man hung things in, more like a place a man simply waited in between shifts. Even if it is only a thing you climbed past on the way up here. A man should have something on his walls that tells him where he has been. I thought about that one for a long time after, longer than I let on to her that night. We talked about other things too, as the weeks went on. Things that had nothing to do with wings or trials or stairs. She asked me, around week 9, what work meant to humans, whether we chose it the way dragons chose their flight roles, or whether it was assigned, and I told her the truth. That for most of us it was somewhere uncomfortably between the two. Chosen in theory, constrained in practice by what paid and what was available, and what a man's body could still manage by the time he understood himself well enough to know what he actually wanted. She found that strange. Dragon flight roles, she explained, were determined early, by aptitude and temperament observed from hatching onward, and a dragon generally knew by adolescence what role the Reach would ask of her. Scout, defender, council voice, breeder of the line, a dozen others, and trained toward it without the long, uncertain drift I described as ordinary to human working life. That sounds efficient, I said. Also sounds like it'd be hell if you turned out to want something other than what they decided for you at 6 months old. Around week 10, she asked me to tell her what the stars looked like from the lower stairwell windows, the ones near the bottom of the tower that still had unfogged glass, because she said dragons saw color differently in low light than humans did, and she was curious whether we were looking at the same sky at all, or two different skies wearing the same name. I walked her through what I could see most nights. The long, pale smear of the Reach's home arm low on the horizon, the brighter cluster of inter-system traffic lights that never quite stopped moving. What she could pick out from up at 410 that I couldn't from the ground. The faint heat signature trails of orbital traffic that human eyes apparently couldn't register at all without instruments. We spent the better part of an hour comparing skies that night, hers and mine, and agreed in the end that we were probably looking at the same handful of stars and simply naming them differently, which struck me at the time as about as good a description of the whole arrangement between us as I could have come up with. By week 14, we'd settled into something that, if I'm honest, felt less like a rescue and more like a kind of late, strange friendship, two creatures from very different scales of life, meeting in the middle of a dead stairwell at midnight, because the alternative, for both of us, was being alone with our own particular failures, and neither of us much wanted that anymore. She told me on a night past week 15, on landing 450, the closest she'd come down to meet me yet. The wing has healed enough that my flight signature will register on any standard search sweep. If one passes close, I have been careful to stay shielded by the tower's structure, but the tower will not shield me forever. What happens when they find you? She was quiet a long moment, working the bad wing slowly, testing the strut's mend, the way she did most nights now, without quite seeming to notice she was doing it. I do not know. I have thought about it less than I should have. I think, because thinking about it required deciding what I wanted, and for a long time I did not want anything beyond not being found yet. She looked at me, and there was something steadier in the look than there'd been in any of the previous 15 weeks. I think now I want to go home and finish the trial. Not because failing it once means I must finish it to be acceptable, because I find I am ready to choose it again, on my own account, and that is a different thing entirely from being made to. Sounds like the right reason, I said. It is the only reason that has ever mattered. In the old way of thinking, she said. I had simply forgotten that. Somewhere on the trial floor, in all the falling, On a night I happened to be 300 steps up with a thermos and a burner, and the particular dull ache in my left knee that meant rain was coming, though Orson Station's domes hadn't let real rain through in longer than I'd lived there. I heard them before I saw them, a sound less like thunder rolling than thunder arriving all at once, the displacement of a great deal of air by a great many wings moving in close formation. "110, to find the open shaft above me, full of dragons. There were 11 of them, hanging in formation inside the tower's dead launch column, as though the structure had been built to hold exactly that shape, rather than the other way around, and even with my limited understanding of dragonkind, I could read the hierarchy plainly in how they held themselves. A vanguard of 6 in matched dark bronze scale, arranged in a loose protective ring, and at the formation's center, larger than any of the rest, an old dragon the deep red-black of cooling iron, scarred along one flank in a way that spoke of a long career, surviving things that should by rights have killed her. And the single word carried up the open shaft and came back down off the metal walls, multiplied into something that filled the whole tower, and I understood in that one syllable everything she hadn't told me across 16 weeks of careful, patient climbing. processed and dispatched through some bureaucratic channel. Refusing to stop for exactly as long as it took. Head of the Kelvath Line's Flight Council, and a figure whose name alone, Vethka had told me once in passing, could quiet a room of younger dragons mid-argument, didn't move toward her daughter first. She looked, instead, directly at me. I was standing on landing 310 with a dented thermos in one hand and a portable burner in the other. 16 weeks of climbing settled permanently into my knees. Grease worked into the seams of my coveralls. Nothing in my bearing or my circumstances that could plausibly be mistaken for someone who mattered in any way to an empire. I want to be honest that I expected, in that moment, to be moved aside without ceremony. Searched, certainly. Questioned, probably. Possibly arrested for harboring a flight cadet without reporting her location through the proper station channels, which I had in plain fact failed to do for 16 consecutive weeks, despite knowing the protocol by heart. I'd thought about that particular consequence more than once on the long climbs up, and decided, each time, that I'd accept it whenever it eventually came due. What came instead was the old dragon lowering her head, not toward me first, but past me, toward the bare, worn stairs of Landing 310 themselves, the steel plating where my boots had stood twice a week for 16 weeks running. She held there a long moment in silence, and when she finally spoke, her voice didn't carry the deep resonance I'd come to feel through Vethka. It arrived instead as something closer to ordinary sound, low and rough, like a voice that had gone unused to softness for a very long time, and was trying it again carefully. "How many of these stairs," she said, "did you climb?" For 16 straight weeks. Top landing 611. I never made it past 450 most nights. She came down to meet me partway, toward the end, once she could manage it. But before that, near enough every flight between here and the bottom, twice a week to start. Then most nights once it got going. Call it, I worked it the way I'd worked it on 100 sleepless climbs. The number I'd done in my head so many times it came out without effort. Call it 61,000 stairs altogether, give or take, across the whole stretch. Why? It wasn't delivered with any heat behind it. It was, I think, the plainest question anyone has ever put to me in 47 years, and I gave it the plainest answer I had available. She was up here hurting and alone and didn't want to be found failed, I said. Seemed to me like the least a man could do was climb up and sit with her a while, so she wasn't quite so alone about carrying it. That's the whole of it. Wasn't any more complicated than that on my end. The Reach Mother held my eyes a long moment. Long enough that I felt the weight of it settle into my chest, the way you feel weather building before it breaks. And then she did something I hadn't anticipated, and still don't have a clean word for. Not in any human language. She bowed her head toward me, slow and entirely deliberate, the great red-black skull dipping until her eyes sat level with mine, and then below them, there on a bare service landing in a dead launch tower, that nobody in the universe but a night shift mechanic had cared whether it stood or fell. My daughter, she said, when she straightened again, tells her own counted distance the same way you tell yours. Stairs to landing 450. Steps remaining to the floor of the trial she will retake when she is ready, on her own account, and not one day before. She learned that manner of counting somewhere, and it was not from any flight council on the Reach, who measure achievement in titles and ceremonies and never once in honest stairs. We do not have a word, in the old tongue, for a debt owed to a stranger who asks for nothing whatsoever in repayment. We have only ever needed words for debts owed among kin, where repayment is assumed and expected. I find I am required to invent one tonight, and I have not yet decided what it should sound like. I didn't know what to say to that, so I said the only true thing available to me. She doesn't owe me anything. I climbed because I wanted to climb, because it felt like the right thing to be doing with my nights, and I didn't have anything better waiting for me at the bottom of those stairs to keep me from it. said Sorelka, in a tone that told me she'd anticipated exactly that answer before she'd asked the question, and that the answer had changed nothing whatsoever about what she'd already decided to do. That is precisely why the debt exists in the first place. A thing given freely, asking nothing, is the only kind of debt that cannot be settled by repayment. It can only be honored. What followed took the better part of an hour to settle properly. The vanguard descended in careful stages to flank the landing, mindful of the old structure's load limits in a way that told me dragons understood engineering and material stress better than the company that had abandoned this tower ever had in its operational years. One of them, a younger bronze-scaled dragon, who held himself with the particular alertness of someone newly promoted into a role he hadn't fully grown into yet, approached me directly while the others settled, and introduced himself in careful, formal standard as Vethka's elder cousin, a defender named Koresh, assigned to the search party specifically because he'd flown the home Ares training routes alongside her since hatching. In a tone that suggested he'd known her a very long time and had earned the right to say so. I have seen her refuse easier rescues than the one you offered, on principle. Whatever you did to earn this much trust from her, I expect it was not quick. 16 weeks, I said. Felt slow most nights, going through it. It would have, he agreed. The slow ones are usually the ones that hold. The mended wing held steady against her side, to stand between her mother and the man who'd carried thermos tea and seared protein up 280 flights of dead stairs for 4 straight months. that I didn't understand and wasn't meant to, though I caught the shape of an apology in it somewhere, and the shape of something offered back in answer that sounded less like forgiveness than like relief, which I came to think afterward might have been the truer thing either of them needed from the exchange. I stood off to one side through most of it with my burner and my dented thermos, feeling precisely as out of place as a night shift mechanic standing in the middle of a foreign royal reunion has any right to feel, and not once in that whole long hour did anyone make me feel smaller for it. One of the vanguard, an older dragon with a long pale scar tracing the length of her jaw, came and stood near me for a while, during the longer stretch of conversation, between Vethka and her mother, not speaking, simply present, in a way I understood without needing it explained as a kind of courtesy, making sure the stranger in the middle of all this didn't stand entirely alone while the family business worked itself out. I appreciated it more than I had words for at the time, and more than I've found words for since, if I'm honest. Once the formal exchanges had wound down, and the vanguard had settled into a loose, watchful perimeter around the landing, Vethka came and stood directly in front of me, the good wing and the mended one both folded neat and even against her sides, for what I realized was the first time I'd seen them sit level, and she looked at me the way she had that very first Thursday, except nothing braced in it now. Nothing held back. "I am going home," she said, "to finish the trial, on my own terms, when I choose to attempt it again, not because I failed it once and owe anyone a correction, because I find I am ready to choose it again, freely, the way I should have understood the first attempt all along." "Good," I said, and meant every word of it. "They will want to name what you did," she said. "There will be a proper word for it eventually, in the old tongue, once my mother finishes deciding what that word should be. I expect it will end up something formal, something with considerable weight behind it, the kind of word that gets carved somewhere, and remembered for longer than either of us will be alive to see." And there it was again, that same half-inch settling of the shoulders I'd learned over 16 weeks, to read as close as her kind allowed themselves, to an outright smile. "I will tell them, whenever they ask, that the truer word is far simpler than whatever they decide on. You counted the stairs. You climbed them, every flight, twice a week and then most nights, for 4 months straight. You never once asked me to be anything other than exactly what I already was, while I healed enough to be it again on my own power. I didn't have a ready answer for that either, so I just nodded. The particular slow nod a man gives when someone said the truest thing about him that anyone has managed to say in longer than he'd like to openly admit. They left before dawn, the full 11 of them rising up through the dead launch column in a tight column of their own, displaced air rolling down the shaft and setting the old structure humming low for a long minute after the last of them had cleared the upper hatch. I stood on landing 310 until the sound died away entirely, into the ordinary silence I'd grown used to over 6 years of walking, that tower, and then I did what I always did at the end of a shift, because some habits don't bend even for events like the one I'd just lived through. I checked the bolts. I logged the structural notes in my book. Sound, all flights, no new stress fractures, conditions unchanged, and then I started back down, 310 flights, alone again, the way I'd started every single shift before that one. Flagging unusual warmth readings on landings 280 through 450, and I never volunteered the explanation. File a single supplementary note in the inspection log. Unscheduled structural load event, landing 310, no damage sustained, no further action required. Because the regulations required something on record for the night 11 Dragons had hung in formation, inside a 60-year-old launch column, and I figured a man who'd spent 6 years keeping that tower's paperwork honest owed it one last honest entry, even if the truth behind it stayed mine to keep. Some debts aren't owed to companies, and some of what a man does in the small hours of a stairwell nobody else bothers to climb is nobody's business but his own, and whoever met him, partway up to share it. I still work the tower. The elevators are still dead, and I've come to understand I prefer it that way more than I ever let on even to myself in the years before any of this happened. I hung something on my apartment wall, finally, a few weeks after the search party left. Not anything valuable. Just a section of old stair tread I'd salvaged years before, from a landing the company had condemned and replaced. The kind of scrap a man keeps without quite knowing why until he finally does. Where I can see it most mornings over coffee, and it tells me, same as Vethka said it would, exactly where I've been. On the high landings past 500 where I've no real structural reason to climb anymore, I find a single dark bronze scale set neatly on the bare steel, no note attached, no message of any kind, just the scale itself, and the plain knowledge of how it must have gotten there. I keep them in a drawer at home now, 16 of them at last count. One for every week I climbed before the search finally found us both. Nobody asked me to count them. Nobody checks that I keep counting. I count anyway. And somewhere along the way, I came to understand it was the only unit that had ever actually mattered. Not the rescue, not the reveal, not even the recognition that came down the shaft on 11 sets of wings in the 16th week. Just the stairs themselves, counted honestly, and climbed one at a time, on a night no different from any of the others before or after it.